Education Foundation.
Good afternoon. Welcome. I'm Judy Feniger, a member of the City Club Board of Directors and co-chair of the City Club Program Committee. Thanks for being with us today. The Roman Catholic Church has more than 1 billion members, the largest Christian church in the world today. The Catholic Diocese of Cleveland covers 8 counties with a population of more than 700,000, or more than a quarter of that area's population. Between 2009 and 2010, Bishop Richard Lennon closed 50 churches in the 8-county diocese, citing changes in demographics and shortages of priests and cash. The Council of Parishes are concerned Catholics formed to support parishes subject to closure who are seeking other options. The Council provides forums for parishes and laity to communicate with the Archdiocese about issues of concern. Today's speaker, Peter Borre, is co-chair of the Council and was integral in reversing Bishop Lennon's closing of 12 local parishes. He was enlisted along with canon lawyers in Rome to argue on behalf of parishioners and parishes such as these, and was in Rome when the Vatican Congregation for the Clergy ruled in favor of the parishioners. At City Club, we're always eager to hear from people who make the news, to hear the backstory, and to think about all sides of an issue. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Borre to the City Club podium.
Good afternoon, and to spoil a perfectly fine lunch, I'm going to move ahead briskly because first of all, we have very strict timekeepers, and secondly, I've had the privilege of speaking to groups like this in the past, and I find that many of you have things to say and questions to ask. And I want to be sure that I leave time for that. And my wife at Logan Airport told me, keep it brief and keep it PG rated. I will obey one of those 2 commandments. I am honored, by the way, to be, maybe not at the very same platform, but in a venue that has hosted some truly great men and women in the past. And I think especially of your former Senator, John Glenn, because he's not only a real hero in my youth, but he was a squadron mate of Ted Williams in Korea. There's a close connection between the cities of Boston and Cleveland, and I'm not referring to Manuel Aristides Ramirez, better known as Manny, who was traded to Boston after the year 2000 season. I'm referring to the nexus between our 2 dioceses in the person of your bishop, a product of the Archdiocese of Boston, and became head of the Archdiocese of Boston in December of '02 when Cardinal Law left hurriedly and stealthily, and headed my diocese until the summer of '03 when a Clevelander, at least someone who was a young child, was brought up at St. James in Lakewood, Sean Patrick O'Malley. But your bishop stayed as essentially the executive vice president, moderator of the Curia and Vicar General, until until he transferred to Cleveland in the spring of '06. The bishop's DNA is on both dioceses, and that's why I want to direct my remarks not only at Cleveland, but Boston and elsewhere in Catholic America. I would say semi-facetiously that at least until a year or so ago, my team, Boston, had the prize for being the most dysfunctional diocese in Catholic America. But I think that based on the Rome decrees of last March, you guys may have surged ahead. We earned that strange title because we're considered ground zero for the clergy sex abuse crisis that unfolded on the day of the Epiphany, 2002. Unfairly, because this has been going on for centuries, but in the public mind in Catholic America, it's Boston. But you have passed us because very briefly, and I'm not sure this has been fully understood, the 11 decrees of March 1st of this year are truly landmarks. I challenge anyone to find a case in the 230 years of Catholic America where a diocesan bishop has been reversed in one fell swoop on 11 of his decrees, decided simultaneously rather than being trickled out, as is the norm in Rome, being reversed both procedurally and as a matter of substantive canon law, and there was some misinformation about that in the local press. But I have 50 years of expertise in canon law, not me, but my colleagues in Rome, to validate the point. And most importantly, the first time in the history of Catholic America, at least in the last 40 years, where a bishop has been reversed not only on the deconsecration of the churches, but on his decision to suppress the parishes themselves. And those are two distinct canonical entities. But where are we today? Your bishop acknowledged formal receipt of these decrees on the Ides of March, or thereabouts, March 15. So we've had about 90 days, and to my knowledge, nothing that is canonically significant has happened. And there is a norm in Catholic law, canon law, that usually you have 30 days to react to a decree or an order from Rome. We're really past that shelf life now. But before going into what it means for Cleveland and what it might mean going ahead, in fairness, which may not be my instinct, I want to say that the Cleveland story is part of a larger story, and it's not a pretty picture, in Catholic America. Systemic problems in other Catholic dioceses and the incredible scandals that are detonating in Rome that involve the very top of the Roman Catholic hierarchy. You know about the developments in Cleveland. I'm not going to rehash that, 09, 010. But the decrees that came after 3 long years were, oh Dio mio, OMG, wow. And I planted myself in Rome with a lot of malice, a forethought, to be sure that I was getting from the experts the full significance of these things. But Boston has been the prologue for what's now unfolding here in Cleveland. And let me sketch out Boston because you may not be as familiar. Because I dare say that on present trends, Cleveland may go through some of the experience that Boston has gone through for the last 10 years, starting in 02. The clergy sex abuse scandal detonated in January of 02. The end of 02, December, after 11 months, where the Archbishop of Boston, Cardinal Bernard Francis Law, blasted the press to kingdom come. Lies, inventions, and fictions. Suddenly and stealthily, he left Boston and has never been seen officially in Boston since. And it was announced from Rome that his resignation as Archbishop of Boston had been accepted by the Holy Father John Paul II, and the apostolic administrator appointed to run the show was Richard Gerard Lennon. July of 03, a former Clevelander, Sean Patrick O'Malley, was installed as Archbishop, but your bishop became the executive VP. In the fall of 03, Boston was the first Catholic diocese to announce a mega settlement program. 500 plus alleged victims of clergy sex abuse and a lump sum payment of $85 million. Which is about 4 years on Manny's 8-year contract. And nobody had seen this much money paid out. The Associated Press reports that over the past 15 years or so, somewhere between $3 and $4 billion have been paid out by Catholic dioceses on allegations of clergy sex abuse. I can't keep the zeros in my mind, but if you take $3 billion divided by 195 dioceses, and it's not evenly spread, you can begin to see the financial cancer that's been eating away at some of these dioceses. So in the fall of 03, problem's over, we've settled, 85 million, it's taken care of, Knights of Columbus, a few mortgages, we sold the Cardinal's Florentine residence in Chestnut Hill. In December of 03, we're fine, convocation of priests, and Vicar General Richard Lennon announces that it's time to right-size, as your media seem to put it, the number of parishes in Catholic Boston. Catholic Boston with 2 million Catholics at that time. And so reconfiguration is launched, and it is the handiwork of Richard Lennon. There's no arguing that point. In late May, the results are announced. The process is recommendations from clusters, a term that may be familiar to you. It is literally taking 357 parishes, putting them into clusters, subgroups of 2, 3, or 4, and tasking each group with deciding which parish would you vote into oblivion. That's fratricide. And the rationale given is demography, shortage of clergy, and 1/4 of parishes that can't pay their bills. So in May, by FedEx, nice pastoral touch, 83 pastors received notification that they're done, toast, finished. You get to pick which date you want to close. Now, 9 of the 83 went into vigil. Let's forget the Catholic speak. That's trespass. That's something that we learn from our African American brothers and sisters. If something is unjust, we will sit down and sit in. 9 of the 83 started this in the fall of '04. Today, 2 of them are still holding out. That's commitment of a sort. 7 civil lawsuits, 14 canon appeals to Rome, 5 ongoing. Now, what is the verdict on Bishop Lennon's work in Boston, this first round of parish closings? From an impeccable source, our archdiocesan director of pastoral planning, because we still have one of those in Boston. I think yours got 86th here a few months ago. The director of pastoral planning, on the record, in a communist newspaper disguised as the Boston Globe, oops, I shouldn't say this in live TV, said, looking back, closing parishes didn't work. When a parish closed, people just went away. We were not better off afterward. Cleveland's native son, Sean Patrick O'Malley, last December told a convocation of Boston priests, the Archdiocese of Boston has one of the lowest mass attendance ratios in Catholic America. It is under 16%. The national average, according to Georgetown, not exactly a hotbed of anti-Catholicism, by the way, the national average for Catholic church parishes is about 33%. Boston's under half of that. And the trend lines, by the statistics of the Archdiocese of Boston in their annual directory, between 2004 and 2010, Boston has reported a net drop of self-described Catholics of 380,000, which is half the size of the entire Diocese of Cleveland. And the most severe part of the drop has happened in the last 4 years. It's accelerating. And yet the Archdiocese of Boston has now launched another round of pastoral planning, which will take 288 parishes and squeeze them down to 125 so-called collaboratives. So here we have the residue of your bishop's work, and we're seeing the results, and yet we're pressing on with another round. As the Reverend Monsignor Homer Simpson might say, duh! Now, what about the rest of Catholic America? Picture's not that bright, and you can follow it if you choose. One of the best sources is the Pew Center, which did a massive survey of religion and public life. Yes, indeed, as Judy said, the largest single Christian denomination in the United States today, the RCs, 65 to 70 million, depending on how you count. 1/3 of them describe themselves as lapsed Catholic. Now, if you do the math, that means that the second largest religious denomination in the United States of America is lapsed Catholics. And just a brief sidebar, it's an oversimplification, but it's somewhat descriptive. If you look at the data as it's plotted and so forth, there are basically two different Catholic Americas operating today. There is legacy Catholic America or Rust Belt Catholic America. And that's us. That's the area of traditional European settlement. The Atlantic coast down to Baltimore, the ancestral diocese for American Catholicism. Then you go west to St. Louis and up the Mississippi to Minneapolis, St. Paul. And in that quadrant, you find maybe 63, 64% of the Catholic parishes and the numbers. And then outside, Sun Belt, call it what you will. But the problem, at least for the 60 or 70 canon appeals that I've been involved with in the last couple of years, is most acute in legacy Catholic America, notably Boston, notably Cleveland. And here comes another one. I was in Philadelphia last weekend. The parallels between the Archdiocese of Philadelphia and the Archdiocese of Boston are just uncanny. It's like I was telling Judy earlier on, the parallels between the last days of the Soviet Union and some of the things that are unfolding in the Catholic Church are also too easy to belabor. But let's go back to Boston, Philly. You have wholesale closings of parochial schools, which is a slow poison. But that begins to affect the way you pull the parents into the churches and what happens over a period of time. You have an explosion of clergy sexual abuse. And by the way, this for once is not a cliche. The jury at the moment is out, literally, on the criminal case against the vicar for clergy for about 10 years in the Archdiocese of Philadelphia, Monsignor William Lynn. You have had the very hurried, unseemly, brutta figura departure of two cardinals, our Bernard Law, their Justin Regali. You had the death of a former cardinal, I shouldn't be chortling, the night before he was supposed to be deposed, Bevilacqua. You have new guys in town, Cappuccini, Archbishop Chaput in Philadelphia, Cardinal O'Malley in Boston. Don't get me started on the Cappuccini. You have surging waves of parish closings, and you now have the release of audited financial information, which to my knowledge has not happened here, which begins to show you, in more or less reliable terms, multi-million-dollar losses that are embedded in the operations of these dioceses. But there's some major differences between Boston and Philly. The criminal trial. Nobody was ever brought to bar in Boston. It's just a fact. This trial of Monsignor Lynn has been going on for 11 weeks. The jury has been deliberating since June 1st. Stay tuned for the result. As my grandmother used to say, qui vivra vedra. Whoever lives that long will see the results. Secondly, there is a glimmer of episcopal honesty. Archbishop Chaput acknowledged last week in an article in the Philly media the link between the Archdiocese financial losses for last fiscal year and clergy sex abuse, which he estimates that loss was about $12 million for the year that closed a year ago, June, and for the year that closes at the end of this month. The Archbishop estimates that the consequences booked on clergy sex abuse so far will be $10 million. But let me say this. If there is a certain kind of verdict, and it would be wrong to anticipate the outcome, but hypothetically, if there is a verdict that pins criminal liability on an official of the Archdiocese, then we're going to have a few active Philadelphia lawyers moving in the years to come. And let me remind you, Boston settled 500 plus cases of alleged abuse, because it never went to full adjudication, for $85 million. A few years ago, Los Angeles settled 500 plus cases for $660 million. American dollars. But item number 3 in Philadelphia, which I now think is emerging as the next troubled archdiocese, is the time compression. Because you can take in a certain event, but if it unfolds over a period of time, you can absorb it. Philly is going through in about 1 year, in the words of its own archbishop, Annus Horribilis, what Boston went through in 10 years. And this is going to be very hard for the 1.6, 1.7 million Catholics in Philadelphia to process. So, sidebar, you might say, well, interesting Catholic stuff, but for the non-Catholics, the other 5 billion people on the face of this globe, so what? Well, ask not for whom the church bell tolls. First of all, at the diocesan level, we've seen it in Boston, and I dare say you might see it here. When you wipe out dozens of parishes, you have major neighborhood impacts. I don't have to belabor that. You know what that happens. Secondly, the Catholic vote in the United States is not a block, but it has quite a bit of weight. And my wife, who's worked in political campaigns, has become the expert on some aspects, well, on all issues, dear, if you're watching, says in any election, and Air Force One was on the ground yesterday when I arrived, there are states that are in play, toss-ups. In the 2008 election, some of the most actively disputed, fought-for cases were in legacy Catholic America, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, and in Sunbelt Catholic America, Nevada, Colorado, New Mexico. And in these 6 cases, these 6 states, there were a number of issues at play, but the Catholic issue was important. And I say that because we are now in the midst of the so-called Fortnight for Freedom initiative that has been launched by the Cardinal Archbishop of New York, Tim Dolan. So the blurring line between church and state may be turning into what a friend of mine used to call a swimming pool that has one section that is no urination and the other section is relieve yourselves. Now, with one sidebar to Rome, where I'm headed again, you cannot not be aware of the incredible things that are coming out of Rome. And Judy said, you know, we're talking about 1+ billion self-described Catholics, 220,000 Catholic parishes around the face of the globe, about 18,000 in the United States. Think of the Management 101 issues involved in that, and maybe 500,000 men and women leading the consecrated life, full-timers, which is about the size of the United States Army. I mean, no matter how you line up, that is a force. Now, the Vatican story. The American media are kind of playing it cute. The butler did it. The butler, by the way, is sitting in a Vatican jail, a jail inside the 105 acres of the Vatican. He did it, scoundrel, for his own reasons. No. We are 3 days away from the 40th anniversary of the Watergate break-in. So it occurred to me that I might put in perspective of the dozen big stories that are running, just a couple, but transposing it to those of a certain age who may have a memory of Watergate. Imagine that after the break-in of June 17, 18 at the Watergate complex, just a couple of weeks later, the Washington Post runs a memo. Not, you know, Johnny Jones said to Jimmy Smith that maybe these guys were connected with the Republican National Committee. No. Assume that on the front page you have a memorandum with a control number by the Executive Secretariat of the Office of the President. And it is a memorandum to the President, signed by the Deputy Chief of Staff of the White House, that says corruption in the Republican National Committee. You should be aware, sir, of blah, blah, blah. Last spring, the first major story that ran was a memorandum from the #2 man in the governance of the Vatican, Il Governatorato, Archbishop Carlo Maria Viganò, that spoke of corruption in the Vatican. And the reaction of the Vatican was, somebody stole this document. You can't deny something that is nero su bianco, that is black on white. So it is, well, some swine filched the document, and isn't this a dreadful thing? But it's never been contradicted. Now, these leaked documents are something like a renewable resource. They just keep coming, and I'll just give you the last one. And here my apologies to Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke. Assume that a couple of weeks ago, you find on the front page of a national newspaper the report that the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System has voted no confidence in the chairmanship of Ben Bernanke. Apologies, this has nothing to do with Chairman Bernanke. I don't want to drive the stock market down. And then assume that a few weeks later, the National Police, the FBI, and members of the U.S. Attorney's Office and wherever, District of Attorney, raid the home office of Chairman Bernanke and remove 50 classified files, one of which reads, "In the event that I am killed, read what's inside." This has happened. The president of the IOR, Istituto per le Opere di Religione, Ettore Gotti Tedeschi, was voted no confidence May 24. The Italian carabinieri and prosecutors, with his assistance and search warrants, have removed files, and the picture that's coming into focus is, here we go again. About 1 billion euros flushed through accounts held by the Vatican Bank with J.P. Morgan. I'm not making that one up either. In any case, other than the folkloristic Da Vinci Code aspect of things, there is a very serious problem at the top of the Vatican, and this has immediate consequences for how tight a grip and control the Vatican can exercise over more mundane issues. So, bringing it back to Cleveland in the few minutes remaining, and I'll stay within my time. As I read it, your bishop has held listening sessions with parishioners without giving timetables and has sent conciliatory letters to the priest of the diocese. Canonically speaking, this is nothing. Rien. Zero. Nichts. Nothing has been done. So, what's next? Here again, I go back to Boston to conclude. It hit the fan for us in Boston, to use the canon term, the day of the Epiphany, '02. And cardinal law would not let go. Coming into the Christmas season, 58 priests and pastors in the Archdiocese of Boston signed a letter which they made public and which read, "It is with a heavy heart that we write to request your resignation as Archbishop of Boston," etc., etc. And less than 1 week later, cardinal law scooted out of town. Lessons learned. Private, undisclosed letters will not cut it. Anonymous letters won't cut it. The number of priests who have the guts to publicly sign such a letter counts for a lot. A former seminarian by the name of Jugashvili, better known as Joseph Stalin, but once upon a time he was a seminarian, famously said that quantity has a quality all of its own. Now, there's been some talk that maybe the Diocesan Presbyteral Council should do something. No. That body exists at the pleasure of the bishop, and he can disband it with the stroke of a pen. It's time for the Cleveland Diocese, through its priests, to speak up. The laity have done their part by having the courage to sustain these dozen appeals over 2 to 3 years. And if you tell me that it's not a career-enhancing move for a priest to sign an open letter telling his bishop to get out of Dodge, I would remind you that this was not risk-free. for those 58 priests in Boston, many of whom are my friends. And when you're going up against a cardinal, a prince of the church, particularly one as powerful as Bernard Francis Law, with minimum due respect, that's not quite as scary as going against a single bishop. And secondly, a bishop who has wrapped around his neck 11 clear orders out of Rome on which he has done 0 to date. One of my favorite books in the Old Testament is Zeke, the book of Ezekiel. And Zeke wasn't very happy about what the elders of the chosen people were up to 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, which is a bit before my time. And he wrote in the Hebrew to Greek to Latin to English. Woe to the shepherds of Israel who have been pasturing themselves, the sheep you have not pastured. You did not bring back the strayed nor seek the lost, but you lorded it over them harshly and brutally, so they were scattered for lack of a shepherd. This shepherd has failed. It's time for Cleveland's clergy to speak out. Thank you.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, Citadel of Free Speech, we are listening to a Friday forum featuring Peter Borre, co-chairman for the Council of Parishes. We'll return to our speaker momentarily for the traditional City Club questions, and we ask you to be formulating your questions now, and remember that they are questions, not statements, and should be brief and to the point, and we thank you for that. We welcome all of you here listening to 90.3 WCPN Idea Stream, WCLV, WTAM, or one of the many radio stations across the country. Our television broadcast partner is WVIZ PBS Idea Stream. Television broadcasts of the City Club are made possible by Cleveland State University and PNC. Thank you. Our live webcast is supported by the University of Akron. We'd like to welcome guests today at tables hosted by Baker Hostetler. Thank you for your support. And now we'd like to return to our speaker for our traditional City Club question and answer period. We welcome questions from everyone, including guests, and holding the microphone today is our City Club Program Director, Carrie Miller. Do we have the first question?
Mr. Borre, you spoke about the large number of alleged sexual violations have been done by members of the Catholic Church here in America, and the large costs that is incurred by the Vatican. To what extent do you think that this large number reflects the fact that the Vatican has insisted to this very day upon not giving priests the right to marry? And do you think if that policy were to change, there might be some reduction in the future of these cases?
A fair question. I'll duck it very forthrightly by saying the following. The success, and we've had some success with the Council of Parishes, has been the fact that we have had only one focus, which is preserving the spiritual infrastructure of the Catholic Church. I've got 24 separate parishioner groups who are regular members, and they would come to blows if we came to a discussion of any other issue. One on the far left, one on the far right that thinks there hasn't been a valid pope since Pius IX, if you consider him a poster child. So my evasive technique is this. I know one thing. If you destroy la presenza capillare, the grassroots presence of Catholicism, through these parishes, which are considered the crown jewels of Catholicism, then you can have all of your arguments about this, that, and the other thing. Most issues, by the way, go back to the human sexual impulse. I'll leave that to smarter people to resolve. But I know that if you keep turning parishes into firewood, this organization is liquidating itself. One other thing to slipstream onto your question. When I first went to Rome and started these things, it was, well, you know, you people in Boston, you're weird. And then it was, well, you people in America, you're obsessed with sex, with O.J. Simpson and Hollywood and all of that. We don't have that problem. Then it was, after the Ireland thing, and some of you may not like this, from the Italian archbishops. Well, you know, the Irish are these strange people on the outer edge of the North Atlantic, and they really have their own strange customs. I'll tell you when it came home, when it started exploding in continental Europe, in Belgium, in the Netherlands, and in the Pope's own Bavaria. I think there is a vicious war for papal succession underway right now, which accounts for these leaks. And I think that part of it results from the understanding that the current path is unsustainable. And if the clergy is the resource of the Catholic Church, something's going to happen.
Two questions. First, do you think or do you believe that the closing of the parishes here in Cleveland was wrong either by philosophy or by process? And two, one of the reasons given was the lack of priests. So, and that's not only a problem obviously here in Cleveland, it is a much larger problem. So sort of further to your last remark, how does that problem get resolved?
Well, the answer to the first, yes, and I'm partie prise, I'm involved in this, I'm a party to it. I think it was wrong. And I have the frequent flyer miles to Rome to prove it. But let me go to the second point, because the standard litany of reasons, the criteria, have been changing demographics, shortage of clergy, insolvent parishes. Now, first of all, changing demographics. It took me longer than I care to admit to figure out the trap in this. Because you listen, oh yeah, you go into a Catholic church, it's people like us, you know, getting on in years. Why? The churches that are emptying out are in areas of population stability or population growth. So the reason that some of these churches have empty pews is the failure of the diocesan bishops to bring more customers into the store. The demographics, thank you very much, have been very stable to positive. So put that one aside, and that argument has encountered some sympathy and resonance in Rome. Shortage of clergy, bogus. I know from direct experience, what is happening in diocese after diocese is that the diocesan bishops, including your very own, are not, how shall I put this gently, encouraging priests from religious orders, Catholic religious orders, to staff local parishes where the dry up and shortage of clergy is again a function of the failure of these bishops to inspire young men today into the priesthood. And there is language from the Vatican Supreme Court as well as the Congregation for the Clergy that says very explicitly shortage of clergy is not a valid reason for deconsecrating and shutting down a church. So get with it, Bishop X or Bishop Y. This is not me speaking, this is Rome.
I was intrigued by your statement that there's some sort of war about papal succession. So I was hoping maybe you could elaborate a little bit more in terms of who are the potential players and what's in line there.
Well, first of all, there's a series known as the Borgias, which is rerunning. And secondly, strictly from the headlines, this Pope turned 85 in April. Not the oldest Pope who ever served, but getting on in years. Secondly, I was in Rome a couple of months ago. There was a function, and he shows his age because comes up in the Pope mobile, so-called. Then he's put on what is basically a trolley, and his iron, his security detail, literally wheels him to the microphone. And there's a saying in Rome that, you know, cardinals watch very carefully the medical bulletins. There is, and this is factual, there is the Prime Minister of the Vatican, the Secretary of State of the Vatican, Cardinal Tarcisio Bertone, who's a long associate of the Pope's. The Secretary of State is not like the U.S. Secretary of State in charge of foreign affairs. It is the central office of the Vatican. And with a weakened Pope, which is a fact, that's the de facto day-to-day management place. And it's very clear that the incumbent Secretary of State has ambitions. And in time-honored fashion, other contenders are coming forward.
I want you to clarify the numbers in Cleveland in terms of parishes that have been closed, well, not closed, but that were appealed, and what the difference is. The press had 13, and then I heard 12, and now you said 11 things. So can you clarify that? And the second issue is, what happened when the parishes that were closed had financial balances, et cetera, to those monies, and is there evidence they were used in Cleveland for other activities of the diocese, I guess?
Let me take parts of both questions briefly. On the first question, the numbers game, going into the Congregation for the Clergy frequently and speaking to some of the clerics that process the paper, I was told by somebody who has reason to know, made the rounds of what's new in Boston, what's new in Allentown, what's new in Springfield, Massachusetts, what's new in Cleveland. Get to Cleveland and say, whoo, throws up his hands. He said they received 20 plus appeals, but more like 25, something like that. It was a fuzzy number. He said that over time, some of these appeals were disqualified for procedural flaws or what have you, failed to meet the timelines. But the person who signed the appeal didn't have standing as a parishioner or a former parishioner. Finally, and this dialogue has been going on for a year and a half on my side, when? And I was told there are 12 decrees ready for Cardinal Piacenza to sign. Indeed, there were 12 decrees that were signed on March 1st. And by the way, in the very subtle way that Rome works, that in itself was a statement, and a very loud statement. Because in Allentown, where I've been active, there's something like 12 decrees that came out, but they were straggled, dribbled out over a period of about 2 months. I know firsthand that 10 were, as I've described it, and I'm pretty sure of the 11th, that on the issue of the parish suppression, the bishop was overruled. On the issue of the deconsecration, the bishop was overruled. And overruled both as a matter of procedure, he didn't follow procedure, and as a matter of substantive canon law. That's very big, very unprecedented. It might have been helpful to restore peace and harmony in this diocese if the incumbent bishop had basically given the list, the name of the parish, the name of the appellants, and the disposition, rather than relying on this samizdat network of terrible lay people that lurk in the shadows and try to figure things out. Now, secondly, on the disposition of monies, depende, we'll see what happens. By these decrees, the bishop must restore the parish as a legal entity with all of its worldly goods, including bank accounts, including real estate. And it's not enough for a bishop to say, oh, you know, it's 2 or 3 years ago, this is going to be difficult. Bananas. We were put into this fix by him. He can figure the way out. But all of the monies must be restored. All of the religious objects must be restored. And slow walking this now for almost 100 days is unacceptable.
Sir, it'd be interesting to know what your background is, and is this a full-time job of yours?
Let's see, I was born at an early age. No. I was raised in Rome by a she-wolf disguised as my mother. I had a classical Jesuit education in Rome. Some languages. My father was involved in Vatican matters a little bit. But then if you fast forward, in retrospect, I was at ground zero in Boston in the year 2002. And keeping this PG rated, we were sure, we were so naive, that when the list of the 83 parishes to be closed was released, that our parish, because Catholics are parochial, bad pun intended, we were sure that our parish got there because some schmuck had just transposed some digits on a spreadsheet. So we delivered a petition to the Chancery, and I will keep the punchline PG rated. After an hour of trying to get somebody to accept this heartfelt petition, a very large priest came and said, "We don't want it." And I said, "Please, Father, then tell me what to do." And he said, "Well, you should go F yourself." And that was a moment of illumination. Oh, by the way, when I told that story to my wife, she said, "Well, you get F-bombed once a day, and most of the time you deserve it." And my answer was, "That's the first time I was F-bombed by a guy wearing a long black dress."
In the view of many, the list of closings of parishes here in the Cleveland Diocese fell most heavily on the ethnic parishes. Is that something unique to Cleveland, or is this something that's happened in other dioceses as well, especially because many of those parishes are served by priests not under the direct jurisdiction of the bishop?
Well, parish ethnic cleansing, so-called. We've seen it in Boston, too. And it's not unique. Now, by the way, a bishop rules supreme in his diocese. He's the one who gives the ticket, the right to practice Catholicism, to folks who come in from the outside. And that's always been a bone of contention. But quite briefly, maybe this gets too Catholic for you, but it's interesting because immigration is an issue now and has been for a long time. But at the turn of the 20th century, Catholic America was having problems because as the other groups started coming in, there were these linguistic and ethnic frictions. And Rome, to grow the business, invented this concept of the so-called personal parish, which was not a territorial parish, but a parish without boundaries, but had some common trait. And there's even one that was set up for a while in Wall Street for lawyers and financiers. People said, "Oh, the horror of it all." And my quick reaction was, not really, because when the devil swoops down to take him to that hot place, it's much more efficient to have everybody concentrated rather than run all over. But anyway, so you've had these ethnic parishes, but there's a century of history to the effect that bishops do not like them because they're not quite within their reach. So it's not just here, and it's not a good thing.
Well, it appears that you've rubbed shoulders and had a lot of talk with officials and clerics in Rome of high and low rank. From those people and from yourself, what is your view and their view of the personality and the mental health of our bishop?
I'll try to answer that one factually. To my knowledge, there have been 2 apostolic visitations here in Cleveland. One is generally known, and it was a year ago, in June, when Bishop Emeritus John Smith from one of the New Jersey dioceses, maybe not the Tony Soprano diocese, but a retired bishop who came to Cleveland and by press accounts and by some of you who were involved, was given an office and over the course of a week spoke to a number of parishioners in Cleveland and posed the question, as I heard it, what is the suitability of your bishop for his pastoral assignment? So merely posing the question raises it, puts it there. There was another so-called apostolic visitation that I don't think has been reported, I could be wrong, which preceded this one. And my friend, the late papal nuncio Pietro Sambi, commissioned it. And it was a prominent American archbishop who came to Cleveland privately and had a discussion with your bishop. Nothing came of it. So Rome has tried at least a couple of times in a very formal way to at least pose the question of the suitability of this bishop for his office. To date, there has been no consequence. Let's see what happens next. I'm tainted. I've seen too much of this man from the Boston days. If you're a Catholic, you're supposed to believe in redemption. I'll leave it at that.
What is your view of the Vatican's ruling on American nuns?
It's not something that should really be the subject of a one-liner. And reading this morning online what my own Cardinal Archbishop said doesn't ring true to me. At the Conference of the U.S. Bishops in Atlanta, Cardinal O'Malley has said that the issue is only with the leadership of the Women's Conference, not with the membership. That does not ring true. It's not an area I followed closely, but this leadership conference includes about 80% of 56,000 American women religious. And to try to separate the spokespeople from the group, I don't think is going to work. I think the church is backing itself into a corner yet again on an issue it has never been able to resolve, the role of women.
Do you think at the top of the Catholic Church there is a desire, a goal to shrink the tent of the Catholic Church to a rump of true believers led by the Pentecostal and right wing?
First of all, generally, this Pope frequently speaks of purification. And the inference that I draw, and perhaps the implication that he intends, is to compress it down to the true believers. On a personal basis, when I started this back and forth to Rome, and I was sitting down with an old Jesuit, and I was saying, you know, if you guys continue this way, why, and you know, you're going to just drive the Catholic Church in the U.S. And he jumped up and said, basta, stop. And he said, if the Catholic Church in America 10 years from today, this was 3 years ago, is half the size it is today, we will all be better off for it. Now, as to where the end state, who the hell knows? But Catholic lowercase c means universal. And retreating to an enclave is not the evangelizing mission that this religion has been followed, sometimes with more integrity than at other times. But to shrink and to downsize, I think, goes against the DNA of this religion.
Is there a parallel in Boston with the community of St. Peter that has formed here in Cleveland?
Not really. What has happened is that the 9 churches that went into vigil 24/7 had their lay-led services, but unlike Cleveland, since we were pushing the canon appeal route, none of these groups, to my knowledge, ever brought in a priest to celebrate a Mass. And we had our back and forth with the media, because occasionally it would be reported that at Vigil Church such and such there was a Mass on Sunday morning. No. Whether it was a matter of conviction or expediency, with some advice from guess who, they decided not to do anything other than the act of civil trespass to jeopardize the canon appeals. And one other thing that relates indirectly, in my weird life, we received 2 weeks ago a ruling from the Vatican Supreme Court for an occupied church in Springfield, Massachusetts, Mater Dolorosa, a group of Polish Americans who take no prisoners, who occupied their church a year ago. And we've been fighting to get the church reopened canonically. And the ruling read, the bishop's decree deconsecrating the church is suspended, which is a big deal for us. The bishop is instructed not to sell or destroy the church. The occupiers are directed to leave it. And I nearly got lynched, which perhaps I deserve, when I had to go tell them, you've got a limited period of time to get your belongings and leave the church in good order. And the answer was, supposing this is a trick just to get us out of the church without having the cops to come in. And that to be a pretty rowdy description. So I don't know the facts about St. Peter's other than the fact that it appears that the pastor followed the flock. We did not have such a case in Boston.
Thank you, Mr. Borre. Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we have been listening to a Friday forum featuring Peter Borre, co-chair of the Council of Parishes. Thank you, Mr. Borre. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This forum is now adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.
PNC is proud to support the presentation of this City Club of Cleveland Friday Forum on WVIZ PBS.
Additional support comes from Cleveland State University. Support for closed caption transcripts of City Club forums is provided by the Nordson Corporation Foundation.